Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for this, I think it's the 9th session of our Coming of Age series, Resolution 1325, Women, Peace and Security at 21 in 2021. I'm really thrilled and honored today, especially this month, to have Dr. Hanan Ashrawi with me from Palestine and Ahlem Nasraoui from Tunisia as my guests. We were meant to have a colleague from Sudan, and unfortunately she's been unable to join us because of the coup and the lack of internet. So we'll talk about the question in Sudan, but I'm very sorry that Enass Muzamel was unable to join us. I'll get straight to it and hope that everybody who is with us is able to also send us questions or comments, and we'll try and weave them into the conversation as we go forward. It will be in an informal conversational style, and so let's hope that we will have an interesting, I'm sure it'll be interesting, but also inspiring conversation. And there will be a recording available from the LSE and from the ICANN website and from the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy in Berlin and London. Right. Hello, good morning and good afternoon to both of you. Really fabulous to have you with me. I want to start by first kind of situating ourselves in terms of your work, and then looking at the question of this agenda, Women, Peace and Security, 21 years. Last week, there was lots of conversations at the Security Council, lots of nice rhetorical comments about, call to action and all this kind of stuff. But you were acting on these things long before it became an agenda, Dr. Ashrawi, and Ahlem, you've been active in this space for a number of years as a young woman. So I'm going to start with you, Ahlem, to say, first of all, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do and how on earth you ended up becoming an activist. And what do you call yourself? Do you call yourself a woman peacebuilder, a women's rights activist, a young peacebuilder? Just how do you situate yourself in this world of kind of women, peace and security from the Tunisian perspective?
Thank you so much, Sanam, and thank you, ICANN and Wasil and the LSE, also Center and everyone. So I want to say that I'm very honored to be here today, to represent, let's say, my generation about the peace and security, and also the equation of women being the center of this kind of initiative and advocacy. So overall, I mean, this is a great question because honestly, I never thought about how I can identify myself or classify myself. I would say that for me, it's like a journey, doing things the way they come. When I started actually after the revolution in 2011, exactly the beginning of 2012, it was by coincidence. Originally, I come from Kasserine, which is in the central west of Tunisia, the borders with Algeria, a very marginalized city, I would say. And my city, like any other remote area, suffered a lot from the lack of equality when it comes to local governance, investing on education, providing equal opportunities for youth. So, with all of that, especially during the authoritarian regimes, not only during the Ben Ali regime, the one that the Tunisian population have ousted in 2011, but even before, after the, I would say, 1956 independence, that heritage of colonialism and that heritage of authoritarian regimes have created, I would say, a generation of angry youth, very desperate and very hopeless. And I adhered to that generation because the way I was thinking that Tunisia didn't provide me anything with. But in 2012, it was like a coincidence, as I said. Someone invited me because I had the privilege somehow to speak the English language, to participate in an exchange program in Poland about social entrepreneurship. And with that, discovering that kind of solution and empowering young people, I have came back to Tunisia and I started the Young Leaders Entrepreneurs Association with a group of young people. And we started only thinking about how to solve the issue of unemployment. But whenever we were digging deeper into this question of social issues, we have discovered a lot of things. One of them is why young people like me or like many others who live in Tunisia, the way the regime has portrayed it as a peaceful country, a Mediterranean country, has exported thousands of Tunisian, unfortunately, violent extremists. So that's how we started that advocacy of peace building, of empowering young people, of providing inclusion and resilience through social entrepreneurship, through hackathons, through a lot of competitions. To sum it up, like it wasn't only like about pushing young people to start their own businesses, but it was more about like providing them with something bigger than themselves. So, I mean, this is the overall like journey, I would say.
Thank you. That's very interesting that it starts with the private sort of business and entrepreneurship and then comes into the peace space. Dr. Ashrawi, when you hear Ahlem speaking, first of all, how does it make you feel to see Tunisian and a young Tunisian kind of this idea of a journey, but also you started as a literature professor, if I'm not mistaken, right?
That's right.
How does your story get into this mix of politics and women's involvement in peace processes? And do you describe yourself as a peace builder?
Well, I'm many things, actually, at the same time. Like most women, not only do we multitask, but we are really a composite of many things. First of all, thank you for hosting us and for having this delightful conversation. I'm sorry that our Sudanese colleague won't be able to join us. It was good to listen to Ahlem because it gave me a sense of encouragement and hope. Every time I listen to the younger generation, I know that there is hope. I know that there is an incremental process ongoing in the Arab world. Tunisia in particular is a country I love. We have a special relationship from Palestine to Tunis, and the Tunisian people and Tunisian women actually were pioneers when it came to women's rights. And we've had a long relationship now. It's not the time to talk about it. But when it comes to my involvement, I think as all Palestinians, particularly women, the Palestinian women's movement started in the late 19th century, in the 1890s, and demonstrations and protests against the Ottoman rule, and then in the early 20th century against the British mandate and British rule, and then in defense against the Israeli or the Jewish gangs and the violence. And ultimately, I mean, now we have a well-developed women's movement. But our women's movement has always been political and has always managed to merge and integrate the social, the political issues of justice, issues of participatory governance, and defiance, and so on, together. Because being born a Palestinian, as I said, you are born without much choice. You are born with, as I wrote in my book, you are born with a difficult legacy, with a responsibility, with a challenge. You can never deny your identity, because once you say you're a Palestinian, you evoke all sorts of responses. And so I was, my upbringing was very important to me. My parents were both feminists. My father wrote about women's issues in the 1920s, before he got married and had 5 daughters. So since I was raised in a family that had real faith in women's rights, and my father was a progressive socialist who wrote, who was quite active, and we were sheltered. But ultimately, being sheltered in a sense was a reaction to the 48 tragedy and the Nakba, where our parents didn't want us to go through the horror of dispossession and expulsion and violence and so on. But when I went to the American University of Beirut and I saw what it means to live in exile in refugee camps and so on, that's when I began my activism as a political activist. And within at that time it was called the Palestinian Revolution. So I guess you can say women are revolutionaries in a sense. And I describe myself also as a troublemaker, because I don't want to, you do not surrender to situations of injustice or oppression. You have to make trouble. You have to question and challenge. So as I said, I mean, I became active then, and then with the 67 war, I couldn't go home. And I went to the States to get my PhD and so on. But I believe that this kind of responsibility is a responsiveness, let's say, to your context, to the situation you are in. And when I went to the States, I also learned an added dimension on the women's struggle, that there can be a gender framing of issues of injustice, of political activism. And it is this gender framing that, when I came back in the 70s, was a guiding principle for the women's movement in Palestine. Actually, we did organize on the basis of gender agenda that in many ways supersedes the factional agendas. That we commonality of women's issues, we shouldn't be subject to the divisions within the political setup. So we merged resistance to occupation, willingness to take risks, with working internally in order to empower women and to have a gender and empowered women's movement, and to challenge the prevailing systems of traditional attitudes, customs, and the abuse of these in order to maintain women in their place, so to speak. So my life story is a long one. I've done many things, but I've done it in an integrated way. All my way, in academia, in the legislative process, in the executive committee, in negotiations, and everything. I brought this totality, this wholeness.
Which I think is do you think that this is something that comes more, I see it in women peace builders all over the world, that we have a very integrated, holistic approach as we think about things. So in the same way that Ahlem is saying, she starts with social entrepreneurship, but then it comes to social cohesion. And when we say gendered framing, do you think this is one of the things that is, I don't want to say unique, but is more common when we get women into the spaces?
Are you asking me or Ahlem?
Yes, yeah, I'm asking both of you actually.
Yeah, I think it is.
Ask Ahlem in a second as well. Yeah.
Yeah, it is important. It is very important, and it is common when it comes to women, because we do not compartmentalize, and we do not think of ourselves separate from the collective. And in that sense, to frame things within a concept, to us in Palestine, of self-determination. How can you struggle for your right to self-determination when you deprive half of your population of their right to self-determination? So that's how we frame it. And we frame it in the context that the same attitudes of oppression and discrimination and deprivation of rights and so on are those attitudes used by Israel against us, so you cannot use it against the women. You cannot. So if you have these principles and commitments, you have to exercise them internally. And the last argument is that you cannot liberate Palestine if you're not liberated yourself. This was something my father wrote, as I said, in the 1920s, liberate yourselves, you will liberate the country.
Thank you. Ahlem, when you hear this coming from Palestine and this idea of the gendered framing of the issues, right? That we are, and this to me has always been, for me, the core superpower of our agenda globally, that actually if you enable women to get together and see that they have more in common that unites them as women versus what divides them based on race or ethnicity or religion or political class or etc. That's where the power comes in. In Tunisia, Ahlem, do you see women coalescing and understanding the gendered framing of the issues? Is this something that is new since the revolution, or was it always there and your generation is picking up the baton and moving it forward?
Thank you so much, and I want just to say to Dr. Ashrawi that I'm truly inspired. I'm truly honored to be speaking with her in the same event. But other than that, I think when it comes to the Tunisian, especially the feminist history in Tunisia, it's quite strong, as women were also contributing and participating, and even during the liberation from the French occupation, we have a rich history when it comes to supporting the militants, advocating, having rich history when it comes to women, for example, invading the space when it comes to education, all the spaces that were dominated by men. But the thing also that really breaks my heart is seeing in Tunisia, especially after the revolution, that we have a lot of divided scene, I would say, and divided spectrums amongst women. as now we have a sort of two propaganda or two narratives which are, I would say, fighting against each other. One that's claiming, or they want to like adhere to the European French kind of higher education, like where women are totally free, they adhere to those nice kind of thoughts. And the other one, which is more into like the Islamic, I would say, narrative, and for them, religion should be part of in the center of the identity. I think that we have a lot of common. So for two of these parties, maybe I can use this platform and this event that we shouldn't be fighting amongst each other. Like we can be different. We can have the different thoughts when it comes to religion, or when it comes you want to be secular, or you want to adhere or uphold a certain like religious thoughts. But at the same time, I think this will be used against us women, like to break the ice and for example, compete, like to have an office or to have a say in today's like public policy or politics in general. So I see that all of these narratives, especially now with what's happening in the political scene, you know, the Muslim Brotherhood and what's happening, like a lot of people, they say it's a coup, others, they say it's a grab of power. When it comes to very like micro or level, I see that kind of clashes, that kind of struggles on which narrative is the right one. I think that there is no narrative that's right or correct. There are many narratives, there are many, I would say, stories and many kind of thoughts that everyone adhere to, even on the family level. The only thing is we should like together, you know, come up with a sort of resolution to respect each other, like mutually speaking, and not like encourage that kind of divisiveness in Tunisia, because we don't need this. This will be used by those people who want to like preach, I would say, violent extremism or kind of violence in Tunisia, and they want Tunisia to be always, you know, sinking in marginalization and poverty, and to go backward instead of achieving human rights or sustainable peace in general.
Thank you. It's kind of, for me, as first of all, a couple of thoughts. When you said that being Palestinian evokes all sorts of reactions, I was thinking, as an Iranian, I have the same thing. It's like forever the personal is political, even when you don't want it to be. But it's just one of those issues. But Ahlem, the point that you're making right now about this division of, you know, Islamist versus secularist. I've always found it interesting, because I'm like, secularist means that you can practice your Islam, you can practice whatever faith you want. It just shouldn't be the dominant. You know, no religion should be the dominant sort of force in terms of the law. But this division is something that what you're seeing in Tunisia, we saw in Iran from 40 years ago. Palestine, with the formation of Hamas, that seems to be a sort of a way also to try and divide. And what I find dangerous about it is that when they bring the question of women in, then the division comes into the family. So all of a sudden, they're actually playing on the historical or traditional patriarchy that's there. And you might find that you know, a brother and a sister may be, you know, at odds with each other, or they say women have to do this, and the men are like, well, just get on and do it. You know, what's the problem here, right? We're seeing this in Afghanistan right now, that, at a global level, humanitarian crisis, why are you all talking about women? So the way that the ideology of religion, and it doesn't matter whether it's the Islamists or the evangelical Christians or the Jewish extremists or others, but the way that they use gender and specifically women's status and rights and voice as a way to divide is very effective for them. And I'm just wondering, in the context of Palestine, how have you been handling this issue of reuniting to say, don't let this happen, where, you know, as Ahlem, as you're saying, it should be Tunisia first or Palestine first, not these narratives and ideologies. And yet the ideologies are beginning to win, or certainly they've gained a lot of ground. How do you see that playing out in Palestine?
Yeah, I think in terms of the rise of ideological Islam, it's a result of the failure of the secular nationalist agenda, because that agenda based its credibility and standing and constituency on a political program that failed, not because they didn't do the right thing. I think, yes, there are many problems that we had and failures, but it failed precisely because there was no reciprocity, there was no response, that the language of domination, discrimination, violence, ideology, and so on prevailed And so when you see that language emanating from the occupier, most lately, I think the nation-state law in Israel that says only Jews have the right to self-determination, for example. And when you see that you have the ideology, the extreme right, fundamentalist Christian ideology, the evangelicals, who rose and came to prominence and to attention of the world through Trump and others, you saw a combination of extremism and ideologies. And as you said, all three religions, when they go to extremes, when they become fundamentalist, are exclusive. And when you have an exclusive male mentality, it's not just the patriarchy, it's divine rights. And divine rights give you the power to decide on behalf of the other and to exclude and negate, even negate the other, as has been happening with us. You translate that internally, and it becomes extremely worrisome and dangerous. So while Hamas, although an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, is a religious organization, but it defines itself as a program of resistance. But in its social agenda, certainly it does discriminate against women, clearly. So we have to increase the voices of gender-conscious organizations and people. We have to have partnerships within the women's movement, which is very strong. We have quite a few women's organizations and prominent women in the struggle, even though they are not in decision-making now. But this kind of partnership can help, because when you work for social justice, you are also challenging absolutist, exclusivist ideologies and mentalities. I was giving an example of how a few months back, there was this whole protest against CEDAW in Palestine, because we were trying to legislate a bill on family law, which addresses the issue of domestic violence and gender violence. And so they came up with this horror story about how CEDAW is against religion, and I don't want to repeat all the lies, but then you had a demonstration of thousands of people, the Tahriri movement in Palestine, thousands of these men coming out, attacking the women, down with CEDAW. I said, where are you? We need thousands of these people challenging the Israeli army, down with the occupation. It's not CEDAW, it's not women that are the enemy. It's not your version of what CEDAW has, which was an erroneous version, of course. We need to address that. So yes, whenever you have women's division, it is the more oppressive, totalitarian, patriarchal, and exclusivist system that prevails. And that we have to make sure does not happen. And we should have our own allies, as I said, within our own society, and not to accept the whole myth of primary and secondary issues. Like the liberation of Palestine is primary, don't distract me with women issues and social justice and so on. But
Thank you.
see connectivity.
I'm going to ask you both a question that just as a follow-up from this, before we move on. And it's a question that I come across a lot when I'm dealing with, again, on the international space. And right now, for example, with Afghanistan, that literally I get government officials, diplomats from governments that have signed up to, the Women, Peace and Security agenda and tell us that they care, but their own diplomats in key contexts like Afghanistan and other places actually don't seem to understand or are very nervous about stepping into the space in advocating for women's rights and understanding, and the link between the importance of giving women their rights and having them as part of societies in these places, and the pushback on extremism. They sort of see, they don't seem to see the connection. And this to me is one of the challenges. So Ahlem, if we think about Tunisia right now and the coup, the things that are happening, if there is a pushback and women lose the gains that they already made, what's your message to the region, to the international community, to Europe and others, around what the implications are for the safety and stability of Tunisia moving on, and for things, you know, for safety and stability, because the Europeans and others will be looking at it from a migration standpoint, right? That they don't want more migrants. But I'm really curious about what happens when the world steps back and says, oh, the women's rights stuff is your culture, your religion. We just need to deal with the political elite or the military elite now. What are the risks that we face with Tunisia if that happens?
I think, I mean, to answer this question, I need like to touch base on different dimensions. For example, when it comes to, let me start with the migration, or I mean, the way they call them clandestine immigrants or illegal. For me, like to immigrate or the right, like to exercise mobility, it's a human rights, and it's not something shouldn't be illegal, but rather than containing that and trying like to structure it and organize it, I think that Tunisian and especially North Africans, Algerians and Moroccans and Tunisian are being colonized, especially by France and other countries. For example, I mean, last 2 weeks, France did some sort of cut on the issuing visas for Tunisians and Moroccans and Algerians. I think that kind of solution, the way for France, for example, see it's not a solution, but rather a way of encouraging more people to embark on that journey illegally. Because when you don't give them the visa in a legal way, despite like providing all the papers and everything that they are talented and they want to contribute, or maybe they are just for visit, and then you penalize and punish them for some sort of politics. Of course, they will embark on a journey, they will take the boats and they will come, and they will have more issues with that. But other than that, I don't see that using migration as a political leverage will help like neither them nor us. For Tunisia now, what's happening, I see that we are having a lot of pressure from the international, I would say, development sector, lobbyists. I've seen some Congress, you know, even members tweeting about Tunisia, and even one of the development sector, I forgot her name, she was an expert. She even advised, I think, her government to use vaccine as a way to punish Tunisia for what's happening now. For me, this is a scandal. This shouldn't be tolerated at all. Of course, we welcome any sort of assistance to Tunisia when it comes to democracy, for example, capacity building, expertise from countries who have been through that. But for me, I won't tolerate any of usage, I would say, of immoral things like vaccine or food or anything to sort of pave the way for an interventionist and not respecting Tunisia's, I would say, characteristics or Tunisia context. But overall, I think that when it comes to women, especially in Tunisia, whether from my government or whether from the international political entities or development sector, please stop using women. Stop using them and let me be aggressive. I'm so happy with appointing the newly prime minister, but I hope that she is not being just used to promote that idea that we have women in office and the first Arab women to hold such an office. No, we want her to really have her own agenda, her own actions, her own voice, and not just being used by male politicians to polish Tunisia and try to solve themselves from whatever reaction they are getting from the West. So this is maybe my message.
Thank you. Dr. Ashrawi, so building on what Ahlem was saying and also what I was mentioning before, in a way, two questions. The international community's interventions and use and abuse, or the way in which women are put up as window dressing or whatever to cover up for other things, that this is one challenge. But in a way, I want to go back to a little bit further back and ask a sort of more philosophical question. If in the 1990s, the world had paid attention to what Palestinian and Israeli women together, the work that you did with your colleagues in Israel, if that work had been taken forward and the approaches, the gendered approaches that you talked about had been taken forward by your various governments and, as I say, by the international community, where would we be now in terms of the Palestinian-Israeli context, if that had been really supported politically?
Yeah, the joint agenda, peace agenda between Palestinian and Israeli women started actually in the 70s with activism. It was an activist agenda with a clear objective and with clear steps. We were demonstrating and we were activists and we were working together to end the occupation and to respect equality of rights and so on. So we had an agenda, and it evolved from the activist agenda and the street action and so on into a political agenda and political cooperation, and gradually it became more an issue of peacemaking. Now, when we decided to work on that agenda, we brought with us international women. We called it International Women's Commission, and engendering the peace, because we wanted to make clear to the world that the Palestinian-Israeli issue is not just a domestic or a local issue. It's not just Palestinian-Israeli, it's actually global. And the international community has had a hand in creating it, and therefore should have a hand in solving it. And the women had a different approach, yes. We had an inclusive approach, we had an approach that was more human-based, human rights-based, and so on. And we defined even peace differently. But at the same time, both of us came from political systems that were male-dominated, that were patriarchal. We had a bit more freedom because then we didn't have any kind of government on the ground. The PLO was in exile. We were under occupation, and so direct occupation. And so our leadership was men and women underground, willing to take risks and so on. And this was the definition of leadership, that you want to serve, you want to sacrifice, you're willing to pay the price, that you don't have the trimmings of power and self-interest and so on. While the Israeli women, it was different. They were part of a militaristic system and an oppressive system in that sense. They thought they were liberated in some ways, but the women's movement was actually later. So we evolved gender agenda, yes. But unfortunately, the more the Israeli body politic went to the right and to the extreme right, the more it utilized actual power and violence against the Palestinians, the more it intimidated also its own people. We had our partners tell us that it was fine when we were discussing, ending the occupation and so on. But when we started discussing accountability for Israel and the price to be paid and sanctions, they wanted to reconsider our agenda. We were very disappointed because we said for years we were working on this agenda, and at the first sign of threat from a right-wing misogynist government, you immediately withdraw and want to change our agenda. Why don't you stand up to your own government? And that began the cracks. But let me say that nobody listened at that time, because there was no peace process. We tried to launch it, and when it started in the 90s, in the early 90s, it started with women. Palestine was the only country, the only participant that had women at all levels. Leadership committee, I was there, I was spokesperson, I was in the strategic committee and so on. I had my colleagues, Saad and Zahira and so on. We were, again, an organic part of this because we were an organic part of the Intifada. Yeah. And we weren't in it for any benefit or privilege or position. And we called ourselves the people's delegation. We weren't a government, so to speak. But gradually that changed. I'm sure had they listened to the totality, had they adopted our vision, things would have been different. But we were under no illusions that once there are rewards to be had and to be reaped, that the men would take over and would try to exclude the women very consciously. Setting up a system of governance meant that the men now want to step in and do the serious business, while it's okay for women to pay the price, to take risks, to be, at the forefront of the struggle, that's fine. But you cannot assume that you should have a position of leadership. So we started the whole new battle again.
That's really interesting. Ahlem, when you hear that, is it familiar that women were at the front lines of the people power, and then when the government starts and the rewards and the power comes in, women are being pushed back? Is that something that you've seen in Tunisia, or is it a lesson that you guys have learned and are trying to address preemptively?
Yes, exactly. I totally agree with that. I think that women in Tunisia, despite, as I said, we have a very influential network of women defending women's rights in Tunisia. And as you know, Tunisia was always portrayed as a leading country when it comes, to women's rights. But unfortunately, we have a lot of layered, I would say, violence towards women, even starting from domestic violence, abuse, from an oppressive society that always, deprived women from leading the country when it comes to governmental offices. And even I've seen the way they are demonizing women. So women who are having a strong voice, even during the parliament or within the parliament, they have been always demonized as being aggressive and violent. And I think one of the categorization of Tunisian women, that they were deprived from their rights, they were always like the rural women. They have been used as voters, and once they just cast their votes and they select the politicians, then they just give up on them. They don't like promote a sort of education. They don't empower them. For them, they always like use them as voters, and that's all, and it ends there. And even for now, I don't know. I had mixed feelings when they appointed the prime minister as a woman. Everyone was happy. I've seen all the feminist networks and the women-led organization in Tunisia. For me, I wasn't like optimistic about that, because I think that what the president did, and this is my own opinion, was actually a way of I would say softening the aggressive reaction that he's getting from the international political or governmental entities when it comes to what's happening. Is it a coup or not? So I think that the way that he appointed a woman was just, to promote that idea that like here we go, like we have the first female appointed prime minister. But I wish her all the best, and I hope that she wouldn't like give them the opportunity to use her. I hope that she will always, respect her own voice, and whenever she feels that they are using her, please leave the office. Like, don't give them this opportunity of humiliating women in Tunisia, because we have many talented and many smart women, and all they do is either using us or demonizing us whenever we say no.
Yeah. Thank you.
You raised an issue, Sanam. Maybe we should go back to it in the context
go ahead. Yeah.
of what Ahlem said. I like that. The first issue is the cultural bias of human rights, and the way in which the international community in many cases gives itself a pass, and not intervening on behalf of women, or not questioning governments that are that do not adhere to issues of human rights and social justice domestically, because they say, well, this is your traditions, these are your traditions, this is your religion, your culture, and we are culture sensitive. This is really a blatant abuse of the culture and religion of the other in order to maintain an oppressive situation in place. And it's very convenient, by the way. And the other issue is the use of women as window dressing, as you said, and as you cautioned against, as what we used to call in the 70s women's movement tokenism, and the attempting to destroy sisterhood among women, and attempting to find a woman with a male perspective on power, in order to have her join the system, not just as a token, but as an excuse to exclude other women. And then there is the superwoman syndrome. And we really need to go through all of these things and debunk these attitudes and expose them. And we expose them through, again, the concept of sisterhood, the concept that women have a joint agenda, and that if you want to join a system of governance and you want to be a decision maker, then you have to bring up to it your gender sensitivity, your awareness, your sisters, the collective, so to speak, within the concept of human rights and within the concept of genuine change.
It's very, these things are so pertinent because number one, we saw in Sudan as well that it was women who led the revolution, that it was nonviolent, they were there. And then I went in with a UN delegation, and already the government was, it was heavily packed with men, and they were trying to say, 30% women, which was just insane when you thought really it was women who led it. So we see this kind of push, women at the front lines taking the risks and then being told, okay, now you can step back. And then the other thing that you're mentioning, here in the United States, it's been fascinating to watch how actually the conservative forces have brought women into the political space to be there.
To oppress the others.
That's right, exactly. And the issue that we have with the progressive forces often is that the women, maybe it's a generational thing, but they've been so steeped in trying to be like the men that most of them have been as hawkish when it comes to issues of war and violence, or whether it's a question of Palestine, Iran, et cetera, et cetera. And on the question of Afghanistan right now, I'm even seeing the younger generation of progressive women have been silent.
Yep.
So in politics. So the sisterhood question, or understanding how we are silenced or you're manipulated, or how they pull these strings, I think is really, really important as part of the conversation for generations to go forward. I wanted to move the focus a little bit, since we're talking about 21 years of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And as an agenda that came from the ground up, inspired very much, and I can tell you this because I was involved in the lobbying and the drafting of it from civil society. If it wasn't for your work and the work of the Northern Irish women and others, we wouldn't have had a canvas to work on. We saw it. We saw the work of Israeli and Palestinian women, South African women and others. And we said, well, if they can do it, it can be done elsewhere. But it's been 21 years. Ahlem, you came across this agenda in 2011, 2012, and certainly when you started working with me and my team at ICANN and others. If we hadn't had this global agenda these 21 years, would it have made a difference? If that resolution had never been passed, if we had never managed to bring it into the space of the Security Council, where would we all be? Would these conversations still be happening, or is there a certain value in what was achieved then, even though the implementation has been challenging? And either of you, I'm curious what you think. Ahlem, do you want to, go ahead.
Yes, I think, this is a great question. But to be honest with you, despite all the weaknesses, I'm someone critical, I'm never satisfied. I'm always looking for the gaps. But I think this conversation or this overall agenda was very helpful, especially for girls like me or women like me. Even, I see my friends coming from this marginalized city like mine, like Catherine, and seeing them, attending a high profile events, in the US, or even in other countries, or even in Tunisia, during the national consultancy that were happening under the auspices of UN Women or UN in general. I think it was very helpful because first, it wasn't only helping these youth to get their voices, and getting that kind of recommendation that will be incorporated later on in this agenda. But also it was a joyful moment for these young people when they were attending these events and being, with highly caliber academicians and specialists and experts. You have no idea, Sanam, how much empowerment that kind of agenda related events or side events has given to these young people. It was empowering them. It was also giving them much resilience, even against the violent extremist narratives, because for them, they felt that they have a value. They are being heard. They have a voice, and that they are not only representing themselves. They are like ambassadors representing those marginalized and those wronged, I would say, communities that have been always living in the shadows because of, as I said, the lack of governance and like a lot of corruption happening under this kind of government. So yes, I think that we as young people, or maybe people who are younger than me, they really need this kind of agendas. They need these events because it gives them hope. It gives them hope that despite all the gaps and all the weaknesses within the international development sector, but still they can get the chance to meet inspirational people and they can get the chance to make their voices heard. So I think we can't live without it.
Thank you. That's great. Dr. Ashrawi, when you hear that, how does it make you feel?
Well, it's very important, of course. I agree that they have to feel empowered and embraced, and with role models. And I think, look, the women's movement, as I said, has to be an authentic, homegrown initiative. So what was done with 1325 was also done on the basis of earlier endeavors. And of course, internationally, you had the Nairobi Women's Conference, we had Beijing, in addition to the other different ways in which women fought against oppression and colonialism and discrimination and so on. So there have always been authentic homegrown agendas. And one attack that is always used against women who are struggling now under the context of women, peace and security and 1325 and CEDAW is that, look, this is important. This is a Western approach and so on. So we have to awaken them to the fact that, no, we have our own agenda, which fits in within this global agenda of this global women's issues. And more importantly than that, all these instruments gave us a handle. Mm-hmm. They codified. It's a system of codification, right? Of issues, of women's rights, of transforming women, not just as passive victims in need of protection, even though WPS does talk about protection, but as instruments of change and defiance. And that we have to be in decision making in order to make the difference as well, not just as peacemakers and peace builders and peacekeepers and, you know, post-conflict and so on, but no, as people who have the right to take matters into their own hands, to be part of decision making and to affect change. So this type of codification, this type of instrumentalization, where you have a reference which is global, should not be used, in some ways is excellent for us, but should not be used against indigenous people and domestic women, you know, women at home, by being told you are importing, these are foreign ideas that do not fit in with our traditions and our religion. No, they do fit in because we are the ones who started these ideas. We are the ones who started these concepts. We are the ones who defied injustice and discrimination and exclusion and marginalization and so on, because we know it, we experienced it, and we know what needs to be done. So this is just a codification of a global women's agenda of which we were part. I was in New York when 1321 was being worked on, and we looked at the different drafts. So it's an important instrument to have, and I think more importantly, it's a way in which governments can be held accountable, because they will find any possible way to exclude women, to revert back to traditional attitudes and marginalization. And when you have these global instruments, you have a common system in which you can tell governments that these are your obligations, and therefore you can be held accountable on their basis.
And this is actually, I think the challenge that we're all facing, that we have enormous global connectivity. I always say that this is an agenda that is locally rooted, and we just connected it globally so that Colombia can talk to Tunisia in an effective way. But we have connections into governments, individual people, but it hasn't really sort of become part of the DNA of diplomacy, of international relations, and so forth. And that's the challenge. So it's a question of how do we, and again, I sort of look at it from this, each of us where we're sitting, but what do we need to do differently to change this kind of incremental 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, nice rhetoric, but it's not really happening. Like what would you like those of us who do international advocacy to be saying or doing with or on behalf of, together with Palestinian women? Ahlem, in terms of what's going on in Tunisia, you watched what's happened back and forth. Have you had a chance to even step up and say, okay, we need to do things differently, or we need to now build from where we are in a different direction to give women that power and that, not just the power, but the access and the kind of understanding at a wider public level, because part of this is also our own publics don't necessarily know how women are perceived or what women are talking about when we say gendered peace. Dr. Ashrawi, any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I think it has to be done internally in terms of, not just the public awareness and raising awareness and so on, but activism on the ground. You need to have a constituency for the women, peace and security agenda. You need to have a commonality of language. You need to have intersectionality in different aspects, but you also need to have male allies. And you need to have allies all over, who can stand up with women and who can also articulate a gender-sensitive agenda and work for it. But you also have to be able to challenge political systems. Mm-hmm. The more despotic they are, the more ideologically oriented they are, the more centralized is the system of power, the more exclusivist, and the more they marginalize and exclude women. So you cannot separate women's rights from the struggle for social justice, good governance, accountability, transparency, as well as democratic change. Because all these are part of the same mentality. And don't allow them to compartmentalize women separately. Mm-hmm. Then here you have a Ministry of Women's Affairs, you go home, you go to your corner and you play there, and we will deal with other things. No. It has to be an overriding concept, principle, on the basis of which you hold all public officers accountable and all institutions accountable. And it has to permeate every aspect of the public domain. And it's not easy.
It's not easy. Ahlem, any thoughts from you in terms of how you're seeing this, or again, your experience in Tunisia and what you might be thinking about differently?
I think I agree with Dr. Ashrawi, like on, having, homegrown, I would say, initiatives or events. The international, I would say, development sector is very important. I mean, international organizations, as they help by providing technical and financial support. But how about ensuring sustainability? I think what's happening now in Tunisia, what's missing is how to harmonize or how to educate these women leaders from both sides, be it the secular or the Islamist or whatever, any sort of political, I would say, affiliation, how they can harmonize on their differences and on their own, I would say, different thoughts and diversity of thoughts and ideologies, and how they can break the glass ceiling when it comes to the political parties. As you know, Tunisia, we have a strong labor union, and they have a say in what's happening in Tunisia. We have a strong organization, and we have also influential political parties. So I think we need also to sort of encourage that kind of localized initiatives led by women, and not only like to take them, as Dr. Ashrawi mentioned before, a way of tokenism or a way of impressing the West about, okay, like we have women in higher positions. But other than that, I think when I was reading the national strategy in Tunisia for counterterrorism, I think the only mention of women was mentioning them as either, fleeing the country to join Syria, or as victims. We didn't see any mention of women as peace builders, as actors. They always like portray them either as wrongdoers, as doing evil things, as being, you know, manipulated into human trafficking or being used into this trap of violence. But we don't see that acknowledgement of women as actors, as solutions creators. And even if they acknowledge that they are leaders and they are influential, we always see that kind of portraying these women as demons, as very aggressive, as they are taking, you know, the socially constructed roles of men, you know, by having a stronger voice. I think we need to educate, especially young people using the internet and the digital, how it's really important, or I would say how it's dangerous, you know, to encourage that narrative of demonizing women leaders. But instead of that, we should encourage them. We should harmonize all the efforts, especially on the local level, so we can have more women, peace makers as women, and more women leaders and more women politicians, like whatever the sector is or the domain. I think it's very important to get rid of that kind of demonizing aspect of women, or only victimizing them when we need to get more fans, I would say, for the government or for the local organization. I think that we have a lot of potential. It's just need a lot of attention and a lot of collaboration among each other to make it happen.
Thank you. Yeah, this binary thing of, you know, you're demonizing or you're victimizing and somehow not seeing the totality. And you raise an important question around the cross-cutting nature of you know, bringing, you know, using the internet or empowering people. We have a question from the audience saying, looking forward to the future and focusing on women's meaningful and equal participation. In what ways can women actively engage in peace initiatives with a wider scope of cross-cutting issues? For example, in terms of addressing climate change and environment and others, and being agents of change, equal change. Again, in both of your contexts, I mean, as we've seen, these problems of violent extremism came up in the last 10 to 15 years. Climate change is now very much a critical security issue. Do you see, or again, you come from different perspectives, but what would your advice be to students now or young women now coming into the space around how they should engage and do that intersectionality of issues and identity? Would you like to answer that, Dr. Ashrawi?
Yeah, if I have the answer, but I think, in my opinion, it's important that women be part of every aspect of change. You cannot limit yourself, let's say, to one thing and say, well, I will talk about women's rights and I will ignore climate change. Or I will ignore, you know, ethnic discrimination, or I will ignore despotic system. You cannot do that. So addressing all these things by seeing, as we said, the cross-cutting nature of all these issues, not in a sort of automatic fill in the blanks way, but in a very flowing, integrated way. But to make a difference, you have to have two things, or three things. Let's say the most important thing is your own agenda, your own confidence in yourself, your own courage. But you also have to work for political clout, because they cannot marginalize you where you're not part of decision making and then hope that you can make a difference. But also, along with political clout as a decision maker, you have to have a constituency. You have to have a base. You have to have grassroots connectivity so that your voice carries weight. And to do that, you have to work on the ground.
Thank you. Thank you. And Ahlem, any thoughts on the question of, and actually as young people, how are you dealing with these questions of climate and environment and, you know, so many challenges?
I mean, speaking about Tunisia, I think when it comes to the climate change, we are very behind, unfortunately, about addressing the issue of climate change. As you know, the maritime, you know, like fish and all of that, because Tunisia relies on that, and agriculture, organic food. I think we are very behind, unfortunately. Like, I can see there are a few initiatives, but we didn't have that kind of gendered programming, you know, or lens within that. It was only purely for the sake of climate change, and they were led either by a few volunteers or within schools, like clubs, cleaning campaigns, but it didn't reach the level of creating a sort of national dialogue about climate change and how to support it. But recently, I mean, as you know, the Tunisian president now has opened a lot of files for persecuting those who are involved in corruption. We started and I'm so happy about seeing even the very normal grassroots in coffee shops starting to talk about food security, because now we have a lot of scandals, I would say, that they are under trials about the illegal, I would say, purchase or sale of Tunisian products and food in general. So I think we are very behind, and I'm hoping in the future we can see that, because of course it's very important, and without a holistic approach for protecting our planet, I think we cannot even talk about other topics like security and all. So it's a priority indeed.
Thank you. We're coming close to time. I wanted to ask on a kind of more personal level, how do you keep hope and sanity? Because it's, as I said, it's 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, blockages on so many levels, right? So you know, here we are thinking that, well, our international institutions should uphold this idea of a gendered approach to climate change or humanitarian aid or development. But we work with them. We know our UN colleagues, we love them, and yet they don't, right? Or you say at the local level or the governmental level, the national level. So how do you keep sanity? How do you keep hope for yourself? And are there times or are there moments when one should say, you know what, I've done my piece, I need to step back and open the space for somebody else? Dr. Ashrawi, your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I think you need to keep your sanity, particularly because all around you, the situation is insane. I mean, in Palestine, it is insane. The question of total oppression, of violence, of occupation, of displacement, replacement, of land theft, of demolishing homes, of killing people, and so on. So it's a really insane situation because it's been done with impunity. Yeah. Because the international community sees what's happening and does nothing. So the so-called global rules-based order is not really functioning, particularly when it comes to Palestine, at all. It functions depending on the will of the big powers and the veto holders and so forth. But at the same time, when it comes to victims, there is always a double standard. And that's important to address, yes. But how do you keep hope? I keep hope because I'm fully committed to the Palestinian cause and Palestinian people. We are a people who were oppressed, unjustly treated, for no fault of our own. We were living on our own land, and the world decided to create a state on our land, to dispossess and expel half our people. The other half to stay under occupation, and to give Israel free rein to oppress us. So that, to me, emanates from genuine love and commitment to our people. And at the same time, my approach to women's issues is also based on the fact that, like youth and others and minorities everywhere, we have been excluded and marginalized, and we have to stand together, and we have to really develop an active sense of sisterhood, of solidarity, of working together. And when I see that there are women who are willing to take the risk, who are willing to take chances, who are challenging, when I see young people, and now this is a new generation, and that to me is a source of tremendous hope. Sanam, you can't imagine how empowered I feel when generation after generation, the Palestinian people are actively resisting oppression and occupation and discrimination, are actively standing up for their rights, using different instruments and means. Like now, talk about digital diplomacy, social media, and the interlinkages, and the rising solidarity movements. You know, governments are extremely biased, motivated by self-interest, political expediency. But I see people. I see organizations, grassroots movements, intellectual movements, academic circles, minority groups standing up and saying there is this global solidarity, and we see you. And they placed us as part of this conversation. And when you become part of the rights conversation, rather than part of a politically expedient power decision-making by the men all over the world, that's when you begin to know that you are making a difference. It is incremental, it will take time. We will face setbacks, we have faced setbacks internally in Palestine. But we are working now, and I think there is hope in the younger generation. And there is hope in the fact that they haven't forgotten, they haven't given up, and we as a people have not been defeated. I mean, successive American governments, successive Israeli governments, even a sense of letdown by Arab governments, a sense of abandonment, but still the Palestinian people have not surrendered their will. They have not been bashed into submission as Trump wanted to do. And they have maintained this deep commitment to their rights, to their history, to their culture, to their struggle, and to the future of generations coming. That gives me tremendous hope.
Thank you. That's great to hear and important to hear.
The solidarity movement also is extremely important.
Around the world, yeah, that it's
absolutely.
It's not forgotten. Ahlem, for you, what has, again, for you, it's you stumbled into this work, and how do you keep sane? How do you keep moving forward? Are there moments when you think you want to step back and do something different? What keeps you going?
Thank you so much. When I started all of this, and recently when I finished my degree in London, I always remind myself that I'm the first generation from not only within my family, but even within the larger community that got the chance, I would say, to amplify my voice and make it heard and get this degree and all of this. And whenever I feel tired, to be honest, and I feel hopeless, and I feel that nothing is changing, especially when it comes to peace building, I get those moments where I want to run away and do anything, maybe like start working for a private sector and forget all about it. But then when I see that I was the only one, but after me came like hundreds of young people who got the chance of getting scholarships and studying abroad, that they started being well-known activists or renowned, I would say, academics. And whenever someone I meet, they always mention my name. Oh, because I saw you like attending this event or organizing this event, you inspired me to do it. So I think that kind of privilege that I got, and also that kind of inspiration, even on a minimal level, this will keep me on continuing this kind of journey. And other than that, whenever I feel hopeless, I just, buy a ticket and I go back to my hometown. Because whenever I see those people who are still struggling with poverty, with the bad infrastructure, with only one library, in the whole city, where children, they don't have the equal chances or the equal opportunities, to read books or to learn English. It reminds me of the support system that I got from my family. I'm now 30, I'm not married, and I didn't get that, kind of pressure from my family. Oh, you need to forget about this and go make a family. I think I always, whenever what I tell to my mentees or to young people that I meet, that please don't forget your privilege. Your privilege can be very minimal. It's not only that you need to be rich to have a privilege, but having the chance of speaking a different language, having the chance of getting your family support, especially your father, who keeps on encouraging you. This is a privilege, and you shouldn't take it for granted. You should take it with responsibility, because you are not only representing yourself, you are representing these people, this family, who are victims, and I assume my words for this, of this government, because of the corruption, because of the, years and centuries of marginalization. I think this will what keeps me on always being angry and always telling those governmental officials that you have wronged us, you have wronged our grandparents, and we will keep on being angry and telling you the truth whenever we meet face to face.
Thank you, Ahlem. That is, that's one quite an amazing message and a vision of going back to the roots and understanding your privilege. And I think that's something that I see a lot in amongst women activists globally as well, that it's a question of saying, I have privilege, and how much responsibility everybody is shouldering. It's you know, our leaders are basically powerful, but they're abrogating responsibility. And then meanwhile, our social movements are taking on the responsibility, and individuals are doing that. I want to thank you both enormously for this wonderful conversation and for our audience. I just wanted, before we say goodbye, I want to remind everybody that there are 2 more events coming up very soon for the LSE Women, Peace and Security Center. The next one is October 28th. It's Gendering Peace Education in Between Dialogue, Difference and Dissonance at 10 a.m. British Central Time on the 28th. And then our next 21 in 21 series is Putting Peace Back into Politics, and that'll be November 9th at 1 p.m. GMT, same time, and we'll have Monica McWilliams and others joining us. But for now, Dr. Ashrawi, thank you so much. I'm so glad we managed to do this. And I promised you all that I hope one day we'll be able to have everybody in person at the LSE who has joined in these series. It's really lovely to connect with you again and to hear you speaking, and again to inspire me as well all over again. And Ahlem, huge thanks to you as well, and incredibly empowering as Dr. Ashrawi was saying, to see younger generations coming through and wanting to do this crazy work that we all have bought into or called us to do this work. So lovely to see you both, and I hope you have a good rest of the week. This will be recorded. It will be available as a podcast, and we will be sharing it.
And warm regards to our Sudanese sisters as well.
And to our Sudanese sisters, the minute we can have Enass back, I will have her speaking to us to hear what's happening, and for everybody to follow what's happening in Sudan, because there is a coup. People are being disappeared. It is incredibly dangerous, and we need to pay attention. Thank you very much, and have a good day. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much.